Bullies try to strangle a student in front of everyone. Big mistake. He took revenge. The cafeteria was packed with nearly 800 students when it happened. Every table filled, every conversation buzzing with the typical Thursday afternoon energy that preceded the weekend. Nobody expected what would unfold in the next 3 minutes. Nobody could have imagined that the quiet kid from the corner table, the one everyone had watched get pushed around for months, would become the center of the most shocking incident in Riverside Academy's 70-year history. Ethan Chen had his back against the wall, literally. His hands were at his sides, not raised in defense, not clenched in anger, just hanging there with an eerie calmness that should have been a warning sign. But Blake Morrison, 6'3" of pure athletic arrogance, didn't notice. Neither did his 4 companions, who had formed a semicircle around their chosen victim. Blake's massive hand was wrapped around Ethan's throat, pressing him against the cold brick wall of the cafeteria's east side. Students were starting to notice now, phones emerging from pockets, conversations dying mid-sentence. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Blake's voice carried across the suddenly quiet space. His fingers tightened, and Ethan's feet barely touched the ground. "Walking around here like you're better than everyone else, ignoring us when we talk to you." What happened next would be uploaded to social media 17 times from different angles. It would be discussed in hushed whispers for years to come. It would fundamentally change how every student at Riverside Academy understood the nature of power, strength, and the dangerous misconception of judging someone by their appearance. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, to truly comprehend the magnitude of their mistake, we need to go back 4 months to when Ethan Chen first walked through the doors of Riverside Academy. The August heat was oppressive that first day, the kind of humid thickness that made the air feel like soup. Ethan stood in the main office, his mother beside him filling out the last of the transfer paperwork. At 5'7" and maybe 140 pounds, he looked younger than his 16 years. His black hair fell straight across his forehead, and behind wire-rimmed glasses, his dark eyes took in every detail of his surroundings with a methodical precision that most people mistook for nervousness. "You're going to love it here," the secretary, Mrs. Patterson, assured them with the kind of manufactured enthusiasm that came from repeating the same phrases to countless new families. "Riverside Academy has an excellent academic program, wonderful extracurriculars, and our students are just fantastic." Ethan's mother, Dr. Linda Chen, smiled politely. She was a cardiac surgeon who had just accepted a position at the Regional Medical Center, the primary reason for their move from San Francisco. His father, James Chen, was a former Navy SEAL turned private security consultant who was currently overseas on a contract. It was this combination of parents, this unique blend of discipline and precision, that had shaped Ethan into who he was. "Thank you, Doctor," Chen replied, signing the last form. She turned to Ethan, switching to Mandarin. "Remember what your father always says." Ethan nodded slightly. His father had many sayings, but the one she was referencing was clear. The tiger doesn't need to show his claws to be dangerous. The first few days passed without incident. Ethan found his classes, learned the layout of the sprawling campus with its modern glass buildings mixed with older brick structures, and began to understand the social hierarchy that governed student life at Riverside Academy. It was a private school, not quite elite but expensive enough to attract a certain demographic. The parking lot was filled with BMWs and Audis, gifts from parents who confused material goods with affection. He noticed Blake Morrison on his 3rd day. It would have been impossible not to. Blake was the kind of person who commanded attention simply by existing. Captain of the lacrosse team, son of a prominent local businessman, he moved through the hallways like he owned them. His disciples followed in his wake. Ryan Torres, a basketball player with cruel eyes and a sharp tongue. Mason Wright, thick-necked and brutal from his position on the wrestling team. Kyle Brennan, who compensated for his smaller stature with vicious creativity in his torments. And Derek Liu, who had learned that aligning with power was easier than standing against it. Ethan's first interaction with them came during lunch on Friday of his first week. He had found a quiet spot in the courtyard, sitting under an oak tree with a book about military history. He was reading about the Battle of Thermopylae when a shadow fell across the pages. "What do we have here?" Blake's voice had that particular quality of someone who had never been told no in any meaningful way. "New kid thinks he's too good to eat with everyone else?" Ethan looked up slowly, marking his place in the book with his finger. 5 of them, arranged in a casual formation that nevertheless blocked any easy exit. His mind automatically cataloged positions, distances, potential weapons. The heavy hardcover book in his hands, the pen in his pocket, the loose gravel under the bench. Old habits from years of training. "I prefer quiet when I read," Ethan replied evenly. Ryan laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "He prefers quiet. Did you hear that, Blake? His Highness prefers quiet." Blake reached down and plucked the book from Ethan's hands, flipping through it dismissively. "Military history? What are you, some kind of war nerd?" "I find it interesting," Ethan said, his voice maintaining the same calm tone. "May I have my book back?" Mason stepped closer. "May I have my book back?" he mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "Where are you from anyway?" "You talk weird." "California," Ethan answered, though he knew that wasn't what Mason was really asking. The subtle racism was something he'd encountered before, would encounter again. His appearance marked him as different, other, an easy target for those who found comfort in tribal divisions. Blake tossed the book onto the ground, pages splaying open in the dirt. "Oops," he said with mock concern. "Clumsy me." Ethan looked at the book, then back at Blake. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something that made Kyle take an unconscious step backward. But then it was gone, replaced by the same mild expression. "Accidents happen," Ethan said, standing slowly to retrieve his book. As he bent down, Derek's foot shot out, catching him in the shoulder and sending him sprawling onto the gravel. The laughter was harsh, predatory. Other students in the courtyard were watching now, some with sympathy, most with relief that they weren't the targets. Ethan pushed himself up, small rocks embedded in his palms. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Control is not the absence of action, it is the choice of when to act." He had started training when he was 6 years old. His grandfather, Master Chen Wei, was a legend in certain circles, a former member of Taiwan's Special Forces who had later become one of the most respected martial arts instructors on the West Coast. Under his tutelage, Ethan had studied Wing Chun, the style made famous by Bruce Lee. But his education hadn't stopped there. His father had introduced him to Krav Maga, the brutal Israeli self-defense system. He'd studied Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under the Gracie family, Muay Thai from a former champion fighter, and had even spent summers training with former Special Forces operators his father knew from his service days. By the time he was 14, Ethan could disarm a knife-wielding attacker in 3 different ways. He could apply a blood choke that would render someone unconscious in under 6 seconds. He knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum pain with minimum permanent damage, and conversely, where to strike to cause devastating, potentially lethal harm. But his grandfather had taught him something more important than any technique. The greatest victory is the battle not fought. The strongest warrior is the one who chooses peace even when war would be easy. So Ethan picked up his book, brushed off the dirt, and walked away without a word. Behind him, he heard Blake's voice. "That's right. Run away, little boy. We'll be seeing you around." The harassment escalated gradually, methodically, with the calculated cruelty that only teenagers could perfect. His locker was filled with garbage on a Monday morning. His backpack was taken during gym class and thrown in the shower, soaking his textbooks and laptop. During chemistry lab, Ryan would bump into him while he was carrying beakers, causing spills that Ethan would have to clean up while the teacher shook her head at his apparent clumsiness. They were careful, always maintaining plausible deniability, always ensuring that any complaint would sound like whining from an oversensitive new student who couldn't handle normal teenage interaction. Ethan documented everything in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. Dates, times, witnesses, specific actions. His father had taught him the importance of intelligence gathering, of understanding patterns and predicting behavior. The bullies were predictable in their escalation, following a pattern he'd seen before in different contexts, Week 3 brought physical intimidation, shoulder checks in the hallway that sent him into lockers, a foot extended to trip him in the cafeteria, sending his tray flying and covering him in spaghetti sauce, while the room erupted in laughter. During PE, when they played flag football, Blake would tackle him instead of going for the flags, driving him into the ground with unnecessary force, while the gym teacher, Coach Anderson, looked the other way. Ethan noticed that Coach Anderson often looked the other way when Blake was involved. He filed this information away, another piece of the puzzle. At home, his mother noticed the bruises, the torn clothes, the general weariness that had settled over her son like a shroud. "Is everything okay at school?" she asked one evening over dinner, her surgeon's eyes catching the way he favored his left side, where Mason had driven an elbow into his ribs during a staged collision. "It's fine," Ethan replied, taking a careful bite of his rice. "Just adjusting." Dr. Chen wasn't convinced, but she also knew her son had inherited both his parents' stubborn independence. "You know you can talk to me about anything." "I know, Mom." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "Your father called yesterday. He'll be home next month." Ethan nodded. His father would want to know about the situation, would probably want to march into the school and have words with the administration, possibly with Blake's parents. But that would only make things worse. Ethan had seen what happened to kids who had their parents fight their battles. The torment simply moved to places where adults couldn't see, became more subtle and more vicious. The next week, things took a darker turn. Ethan arrived at school to find a crowd gathered around his locker. Someone had spray-painted words across it, racial slurs mixed with suggestions about his sexuality and his worth as a human being. The vandalism was photographed and posted on social media before the janitor could clean it off, tagged with his name so everyone would know exactly whose locker it was. The administration's response was predictably ineffective. Vice Principal Harrison called Ethan into his office, expressed concern, promised to investigate, and then did exactly nothing. The security cameras in that hallway had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. No witnesses came forward. The spray paint couldn't be traced. "We take these matters very seriously," Harrison assured him, not meeting his eyes. "But without evidence of who did this, our hands are tied." Ethan knew better than to mention Blake's name. He'd overheard enough conversations to know that Blake's father donated significantly to the school's athletic program, that the Morrison family name was on the new gymnasium. Justice at Riverside Academy was directly proportional to your parents' bank account. His grandfather called that evening, their weekly video chat that Ethan always looked forward to. Master Chen Wei was in his 70s now, but still moved with the fluid grace of a dancer and the controlled power of a predator. "You look troubled, grandson," the old man said in Mandarin, his eyes sharp despite the pixelated video quality. Ethan considered lying, but his grandfather had an uncanny ability to detect dishonesty, even through a computer screen. So he told him everything, from the first encounter to the escalating harassment to the administration's willful blindness. Master Chen Wei listened without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing. When Ethan finished, there was a long silence. "Do you remember the story of the monkey and the tiger?" his grandfather finally asked. "Yes, grandfather. Tell it to me." Ethan recited the parable he'd heard countless times during his training. A monkey tormented a sleeping tiger, throwing sticks and stones, making noise, trying to provoke a reaction. The other animals warned the monkey that he was playing a dangerous game, but the monkey laughed and said the tiger was weak, cowardly, that he wouldn't dare fight back. One day, the monkey went too far. He struck the tiger's cub. The tiger opened one eye, stood slowly, and in a single motion that was too fast for anyone to see clearly, he ended the monkey's life. Then he went back to sleep. And what is the lesson? Patience has limits. Even the most controlled warrior has a line that cannot be crossed. His grandfather nodded slowly. "Your line is yours to draw, Ethan. But remember, once the tiger shows his claws, he cannot hide them again. Choose your moment wisely." October arrived with a cold snap that turned the leaves brilliant shades of red and gold. Ethan had settled into a routine of avoidance and endurance. He'd mapped out alternate routes through the school that minimized contact with Blake and his crew. He ate lunch in the library, telling the librarian, Mrs. Foster, that he was working on a research project. She didn't believe him, he could tell, but she allowed him the sanctuary anyway. His training intensified during this period. Every morning, he woke at 5 a.m. and went through 2 hours of forms and conditioning before school. Every evening, he spent 3 hours in the garage his mother had allowed him to convert into a training space. Heavy bag work, speed drills, grappling with the submission dummy his father had bought him, meditation to maintain his mental equilibrium. The physical outlet helped, but it also sharpened his abilities to a razor's edge. His body was becoming a weapon that his mind struggled to keep sheathed. It was a Tuesday in late October when the first crack in his control appeared. Ethan was walking to his AP history class when he heard a commotion from the bathroom. A younger student's voice, high with fear. "Please, I don't have any money. My mom packs my lunch." Ethan recognized the voice. Timothy Park, a freshman who played violin in the orchestra, small for his age and shy to the point of being nearly invisible. Ethan pushed open the bathroom door to find Timothy backed against the sink, Kyle and Derek flanking him while Mason rifled through his backpack. "Check his pockets," Kyle suggested. "These rich kids always have cash hidden somewhere." Timothy's eyes met Ethan's, a desperate plea for help that Ethan couldn't ignore. "Leave him alone," Ethan said quietly. All 3 bullies turned to look at him, surprise morphing into amusement. "Look who grew a spine," Derek laughed. "The silent kid wants to play hero." Mason dropped Timothy's backpack and took a step toward Ethan. "You should mind your own business, unless you want to take his place." Ethan moved forward, positioning himself between Timothy and the bullies. "Timothy, go to class." The younger boy hesitated, torn between fear of leaving Ethan alone and fear of staying. "Now," Ethan said firmly, never taking his eyes off the 3 threats in front of him. Timothy grabbed his backpack and bolted from the bathroom. Kyle moved to block the door after him, trapping Ethan inside. "Big mistake," Mason said, cracking his knuckles. "Blake's not here to call us off this time." Ethan's stance shifted subtly, weight transferring to the balls of his feet, hands open and relaxed at his sides. His breathing deepened, heart rate actually slowing as his training took over. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away," Ethan said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Derek laughed. "One chance? There's 3 of us and 1 of you. You can't even do basic math?" Mason lunged forward, attempting to grab Ethan by the collar. It was a clumsy, telegraphed movement, the kind of aggression that relied on size and intimidation rather than skill. Ethan moved like water, flowing around Mason's grasp, his hand coming up to redirect the larger boy's momentum. Mason's face met the bathroom mirror with a crack that spiderwebbed the glass. He dropped to his knees, blood streaming from his nose. Kyle and Derek stood frozen for a moment, their brains struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Their moment of hesitation was all Ethan needed. He could have ended it there, could have walked out while they were still in shock. But something had shifted inside him. Some carefully maintained barrier had cracked. "I said leave him alone," Ethan repeated, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Next time I won't be so gentle." He walked out of the bathroom, leaving Mason groaning on the floor and the other 2 too stunned to follow. Word of the bathroom incident spread through the school like wildfire, growing and mutating with each retelling. By the end of the day, versions ranged from Ethan having given Mason a bloody nose to Ethan being some kind of secret ninja who had taken down all 3 bullies simultaneously. Blake found Ethan after school that day, catching him as he walked toward the parking lot where his mother would pick him up. "I heard you had a run-in with my boys," Blake said, falling into step beside him. Ryan and 2 other lacrosse players flanked them, creating a moving box of intimidation. "They were bothering Timothy Park," Ethan replied, continuing to walk. "And that's your problem because?" Ethan stopped and looked directly at Blake for the first time since their initial encounter. "Because someone has to stand up to you." Blake's expression darkened. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think because you got lucky with Mason that you're tough now? I think you're a coward who needs 4 friends to feel strong," Ethan said quietly. I think you pick on people smaller than you because you're afraid of anyone who might actually fight back. And I think you know, deep down, that everything about you is fake. Your confidence, your strength, your friends who only follow you because they're afraid of becoming your targets." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ryan stepped forward, but Blake held up a hand to stop him. "You just signed your death warrant," Blake said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you've started." Ethan shouldered his backpack and continued walking. "Yes, I do." The next 3 weeks were a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. Blake was smarter than Ethan had given him credit for, understanding that physical confrontation in the aftermath of the bathroom incident would be too obvious. Instead, he orchestrated a systematic destruction of Ethan's daily life. Rumors spread that Ethan had been expelled from his previous school for bringing a weapon, that he was mentally unstable, dangerous, that he'd threatened to hurt other students. Some claimed he kept a hit list, others that he'd been seen talking to himself, planning violence. Teachers began to look at him differently, conversations stopping when he entered rooms. Students gave him a wide berth in the hallways, not out of respect, but out of fear. Even Timothy Park avoided him, mumbling an apology about his parents not wanting him to associate with troubled students. His isolation became complete. Where before he had been ignored or targeted, now he was actively shunned. He ate alone, worked on group projects alone, existed in a bubble of engineered loneliness that pressed in on him from all sides. His mother noticed the change, the way he'd become even quieter, the way he spent every free moment training as if preparing for war. "Ethan, what's really going on?" she asked one evening, finding him in the garage at 11 p.m., his knuckles bloody from the heavy bag. He paused mid-strike, sweat dripping down his face. "Nothing I can't handle." "This isn't handling it," she said, gesturing at his raw hands. "This is preparing for something. What aren't you telling me?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, but he recognized the voice in the attached audio file. Blake's voice, recorded clearly. "Tomorrow. Cafeteria, lunchtime. Be there or we come find you. And trust me, you don't want us to come find you." His mother heard it too, her face hardening with maternal fury. "That's it. I'm calling the school. I'm calling the police. This has gone too far." "No," Ethan said firmly. "That will only make it worse. And the police won't do anything about a vague threat from a minor. You know that." "Then what? You're just going to walk into whatever trap they're setting?" Ethan wrapped his hands, methodical and precise. "Sometimes, Mom, the only way out is through." She wanted to argue. He could see it in her face. But she also saw something in his eyes, a resolution that reminded her painfully of his father. The same look James had when he talked about his missions, the calm before necessary violence. "Your father would know what to do," she said quietly. "Father would tell me to assess the tactical situation, identify my objectives, and execute with precision and minimal collateral damage," Ethan recited. "He'd also tell me that sometimes you have to make examples of enemies to prevent future conflicts." Dr. Chen pulled her son into a fierce hug. "Just, please be careful. You're all I have while your father's gone." "I'll be careful," he promised, though they both knew careful was a relative term in the coming storm. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He meditated instead, centering himself, preparing mentally for what was to come. He ran through scenarios, calculated probabilities, identified escape routes, and defensive positions in the cafeteria. He wrapped his ribs with athletic tape, protection against body shots. He chose his clothes carefully, loose enough to allow movement, nothing that could be easily grabbed. The morning came gray and overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Ethan moved through his morning classes on autopilot, his mind elsewhere, his body relaxed but ready. Other students seemed to sense something, the whispers following him more intense than usual, phones out and ready as if everyone knew something was coming. The cafeteria at Riverside Academy was a massive space designed to hold the entire student body if necessary. 3 levels with the main floor opening up to a mezzanine where additional seating overlooked the primary dining area. Industrial windows let in natural light, and the acoustics were such that sound carried easily across the space. When Ethan entered at exactly 12:15, the normal chaos of lunchtime seemed to pause. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and a path cleared as he walked toward the center of the room. He could see them already, Blake and his entire crew, not just the usual 4, but 8 members of the lacrosse team, forming a loose circle near the windows. Blake stood in the center, his confidence radiating outward like heat from a fire. He'd chosen his battlefield well, public enough that Ethan couldn't refuse without complete humiliation, crowded enough that teachers would have difficulty intervening quickly, spacious enough for whatever Blake had planned. "There he is," Blake announced, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. "The hero of Riverside Academy. The tough guy who thinks he's better than everyone else." Ethan stopped about 10 feet from the circle, his posture relaxed but alert. He could see the positions of everyone, noted the 2 security cameras that covered this area, spotted Ms. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher on lunch duty at the far end of the room. Too far to intervene quickly, probably by design. "What do you want, Blake?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but loud enough to be heard by the growing audience. "What do I want?" Blake stepped forward, his lacrosse teammates tightening their circle. "I want you to understand something. This school has a natural order. There are people who matter and people who don't, people who belong, and people who should know their place. And you think you get to decide which is which?" Blake's smile was cold. "I don't think. I know. See, that's what you never understood. It's not about me personally. It's about maintaining the system. When someone like you disrupts that system, thinks they can change the rules, it threatens everything. The system where you terrorize anyone you see as weak?" Ethan's voice remained steady. "Where you and your friends act like predators because no one's ever held you accountable." Mason pushed through the circle, his nose still bandaged from their bathroom encounter. "You got lucky once. Won't happen again." The crowd was growing, students on the mezzanine level leaning over to watch, phones out and recording. Ethan could hear someone live streaming, narrating the confrontation for viewers who couldn't see. "Here's what's going to happen," Blake said, taking another step forward. "You're going to apologize. To me, to Mason, to everyone here for thinking you could challenge the way things work. You're going to get on your knees and beg forgiveness. And then you're going to transfer schools because you don't belong here." "No." The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Blake's expression darkened. "No? No apology, no kneeling, no transfer, no." Ryan laughed harshly. "You really don't get it, do you? Look around. You're surrounded. You're outnumbered 8-1. You think you're some kind of martial arts master because you sucker-punched Mason? This is the real world." Ethan's eyes never left Blake's. "You want to know what I think? I think you're scared. All of you. Scared that if one person stands up to you, others will follow. Scared that your whole power structure is built on fear and intimidation rather than actual strength. Scared that deep down, you're exactly what you accuse others of being, weak." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Someone dropped a tray in the silence, the crash making everyone jump. Blake's face flushed red. "Grab him." They moved simultaneously, 8 athletes converging on a single target. But Ethan had been expecting it, had been preparing for it since the moment he walked in. As they closed in, time seemed to slow, his perception sharpening to crystal clarity. Mason reached him first, coming in high with a wild haymaker. Ethan ducked under it, his hand shooting up to catch Mason's wrist, using the larger boy's momentum to flip him onto a nearby table, which collapsed under the impact. Lunch trays flew everywhere, students scrambling back. Kyle came from the left, trying to grab Ethan in a bear hug. Ethan drove an elbow backward into Kyle's solar plexus, then grabbed his arm and executed a perfect shoulder throw that sent Kyle crashing into Derek, both of them going down in a tangle of limbs. Ryan tried to tackle him from behind, going for Ethan's legs. Ethan sprawled backward, avoiding the takedown while simultaneously wrapping his arm around Ryan's neck in a guillotine choke. But he didn't hold it, instead using it to control Ryan's position, before driving a knee into his ribs and pushing him away. 3 down in less than 5 seconds. But the others were more cautious now, circling like wolves, looking for an opening. The crowd was screaming, a mix of shock and excitement. Someone yelled for a teacher, but the chaos was too intense for any authority figure to push through quickly. 2 lacrosse players rushed him simultaneously from opposite sides. Ethan jumped straight up, his legs splitting into a perfect aerial split kick that caught both attackers in the face. They stumbled back, blood streaming from broken noses. Another tried to blindside him, but Ethan had already mapped everyone's position. He pivoted, caught the attacker's arm, and used a textbook Aikido technique to redirect his momentum into the wall. The impact was brutal, leaving the boy dazed and struggling to stand. Blake watched his team being systematically dismantled with growing rage and desperation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to overwhelm him with numbers, supposed to put him in his place, supposed to restore the natural order. "Everyone together!" Blake shouted. "All at once!" The remaining fighters, including some who had gotten back up, rushed Ethan in a coordinated assault. For a moment, it looked like they might succeed through sheer mass. Bodies collided, hands grabbed for purchase, the entire group becoming a writhing mass of violence. But Ethan had trained for this exact scenario. Multiple attackers in confined spaces was a specialty of Krav Maga. He became a whirlwind of precise violence, an eye gouge here, a throat strike there, targeting joints and pressure points with surgical precision. He used attackers against each other, redirecting their force so they collided, tangled, impeded each other's movements. When someone managed to grab his shirt, he simply let them pull him forward, using the momentum to drive his forehead into their nose. When someone tried to choke him from behind, he dropped his weight, grabbed their arm, and executed a throw that sent them flying over his shoulder. The crowd had formed a complete circle now, students standing on tables to see better. The roar of voices deafening. But above it all, one voice cut through. "Enough!" But Blake wasn't listening. He'd stayed out of the initial assault, watching, waiting for his moment. Now, with his teammates scattered and groaning, he saw his chance. Ethan was breathing hard, his shirt torn, a cut above his eye bleeding slightly. Blake rushed forward while Ethan was turning to face another attacker. Blake's arm went around Ethan's throat from behind, a crude but effective chokehold. He was bigger, stronger, and he had the element of surprise. His forearm pressed against Ethan's windpipe, cutting off air. "Got you now," Blake hissed in his ear. "Not so tough when you can't breathe, are you?" The crowd gasped, some calling for Blake to stop, others frozen in shock. This had crossed a line from a fight to something potentially lethal. Blake's arm tightened, and Ethan's hands came up to grab at the choking arm, his face already turning red. "This is what happens," Blake announced to the room, maintaining the choke. "This is what happens when someone doesn't know their place." Miss Rodriguez was pushing through the crowd, but she was still 20 feet away. Security was coming, but not fast enough. Blake's teammates were starting to get back to their feet, moving to form a barrier between their captain and any intervention. Ethan's vision was starting to tunnel, black spots dancing at the edges. But panic never entered his mind. His grandfather's training was too deep, too ingrained. He knew exactly how long he had before unconsciousness, knew exactly what he needed to do. His hand dropped from Blake's arm to his own pocket. In one smooth motion, he pulled out a tactical pen his father had given him. Perfectly legal, just a sturdy writing instrument that happened to be made of aircraft aluminum. He drove it backward into Blake's thigh, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to make him loosen his grip reflexively. That split second was all Ethan needed. He tucked his chin, creating space, then grabbed Blake's arm with both hands. Using a combination of leverage and timing, he threw his hips back and executed a perfect seoi nage, a shoulder throw that sent Blake flying over his shoulder to crash onto the cafeteria floor. But Ethan didn't stop there. As Blake tried to get up, Ethan transitioned smoothly into an armbar, hyperextending Blake's elbow to the point just before breaking. "Stop!" Blake screamed, his voice high with pain and fear. "Stop! Please!" Ethan leaned close, his voice calm despite everything. "Yield. Say it loud enough for everyone to hear." "I yield," Blake shouted. "I yield." Ethan released the hold and stood slowly, surveying the damage. 8 athletes were scattered around the cafeteria, some conscious and groaning, others being helped by friends. Blake was curled on the floor, cradling his arm. The entire space was silent, except for the sound of harsh breathing and someone crying. Ethan realized it was Mason, whose nose was definitely broken this time. Miss Rodriguez finally reached the center of the circle, her face pale with shock. What happened here?" Before Ethan could respond, a student called out from the crowd, "I got it all on video." Blake and his friends attacked him, 8 against 1. Another voice, "Blake tried to strangle him." We all saw it. More voices joined in, students who had been silent for months, suddenly finding their courage. "They've been bullying people all year. Blake threatened him yesterday. Mason and Kyle cornered me last week. They take people's money." The accusations poured out like a dam breaking, years of suppressed fear and resentment finally finding voice. Blake looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed kingdom crumbling in real time. Security officers burst into the cafeteria, followed by Vice Principal Harrison and the school nurse. They took in the scene, 8 large athletes defeated, 1 smaller student standing calmly in the center, and hundreds of witnesses with video evidence. "Everyone involved to the office now," Harrison commanded, though his usual authority seemed shaken. As the security officers helped Blake to his feet, he looked at Ethan with something between hatred and bewilderment. "How?" he asked simply. Ethan wiped blood from the cut above his eye, his expression neutral. "You thought I was weak because I chose not to fight. You confused restraint with inability. That was your first mistake." What was my second?" Blake asked, despite himself, thinking that fear was the same as respect. That power came from making others feel small. Real strength isn't about domination, Blake. It's about protection. It's about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. It's about choosing to be better than your worst impulses. The paramedics had arrived now, checking on the injured. None of the injuries were severe. Ethan had been precise in his application of force, using just enough to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. Even Blake's arm, while painful, wasn't actually injured beyond some strain. As they were being led to the office, Timothy Park pushed through the crowd. "Ethan!" he called out. Ethan paused, looking at the younger student he'd defended weeks ago. "Thank you," Timothy said simply. "For everything." Others began to echo the sentiment, students who had suffered under Blake's reign, finding their voices. Sarah Williams, who Blake had humiliated for her weight. David Martinez, whose lunch money had been a regular source of income for the Bullies. Jennifer Liu, who had transferred classes to avoid Kyle's harassment. Vice Principal Harrison looked deeply uncomfortable as more and more students began speaking up, sharing stories, showing saved messages and photos, documenting months of bullying that the administration had ignored or dismissed. In the office, the full scope of the situation became clear. 17 different videos of the fight had been uploaded to social media within minutes. The footage clearly showed Blake initiating the violence, the 8-on-1 assault, and most damningly, Blake attempting to strangle Ethan while announcing his intention to the entire cafeteria. Harrison tried to maintain his usual approach. Fighting is against school policy. Everyone involved will face suspension. With all due respect, Dr. Chen's voice cut through as she entered the office, having been called by the school. "My son was attacked by 8 students. He defended himself. I've already contacted our attorney, and I'm sure the parents of the other victims of Mr. Morrison's behavior will be interested in joining a discussion about the school's failure to protect its students." Behind her entered a man in a crisp suit. The school's principal, Dr. Margaret Foster, who had been in a board meeting when the incident occurred. She took in the scene, the videos playing on multiple phones, the bruised and battered lacrosse team, and Ethan sitting calmly despite his torn clothes and minor injuries. "Mr. Harrison," she said coldly, "I'll take it from here. Blake, your parents are on their way. The rest of you, the nurse will check you over." Then your parents will be called." She turned to Ethan. "Mr. Chen, are you injured?" "Nothing serious, ma'am." "Good. You and your mother, please come with me." In Dr. Foster's office, the full story emerged. She reviewed the videos, listened to Ethan's account, and pulled up attendance and incident records that showed a pattern of complaints against Blake and his group that had been consistently dismissed or minimized. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Chen," she said finally. "The school failed you. We failed all the students who were victimized by this behavior. That ends today." The consequences were swift and severe. Blake Morrison was expelled. The attempted strangulation caught on multiple videos being impossible to dismiss or minimize. His father threatened to sue, to pull funding, to destroy the school's reputation. But when faced with video evidence and the possibility of criminal charges for assault, he quietly withdrew his son. Mason, Kyle, Derek, and Ryan received long-term suspensions and were banned from all athletic programs. The other lacrosse players involved received shorter suspensions and mandatory counseling. Vice Principal Harrison was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his handling of bullying complaints. Coach Anderson was fired when it came to light that he had actively encouraged the lacrosse team's behavior, seeing it as building character and establishing dominance. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of Riverside Academy itself. Ethan's stand had broken the spell of fear that had held so many students silent. Anti-bullying groups formed organically. Students began looking out for each other, and the social hierarchy that had seemed so fixed began to crumble and reshape into something healthier. Ethan himself became something of a legend, though he tried to avoid the attention. Students wanted to know where he'd learned to fight, wanted him to teach them, wanted to be his friend now that he'd proven himself. But he remained much the same as before, quiet, studious, preferring his books to social gatherings. He did, however, start a self-defense club that met twice a week after school. He taught basic awareness, escape techniques, and the philosophy his grandfather had instilled in him. The club grew quickly, attracting not just victims of bullying, but athletes who wanted to learn real combat skills, girls who wanted to feel safer, and even some former bullies who were genuinely trying to change. 3 weeks after the cafeteria incident, Ethan was approached by an unexpected visitor. Blake Morrison stood outside the dojo space the school had given the self-defense club, his arm still in a sling from the strain, though Ethan knew it was mostly for show at this point. "Can we talk?" Blake asked, his usual arrogance replaced by something Ethan hadn't seen before: humility. Ethan studied him for a moment, then nodded, leading him to a quiet corner of the gym. "I hate you," Blake began, which wasn't the opening Ethan had expected. "I hate that you humiliated me. I hate that you took everything from me. I hate that you were right." Ethan waited, saying nothing. "My dad pulled me out of Riverside, obviously. I'm going to Milton Prep across town. But the videos, everyone's seen them. Everyone knows what happened. My reputation is destroyed." "Reputations can be rebuilt," Ethan said quietly. "The question is, what kind of reputation you want to build going forward?" Blake laughed bitterly. "You think I can just change? Become some kind of good guy? I think anyone can change if they choose to. The question is whether you will. My therapist says I have anger issues stemming from my relationship with my father," Blake said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "Says I was projecting my own insecurities onto others, using violence and intimidation to feel powerful because I felt powerless at home." Ethan nodded. It wasn't surprising. He'd seen glimpses of Blake's father during school events, a man who demanded perfection, who saw his son as an extension of his own ego rather than as an individual. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Blake continued. "I know I don't deserve it. I wanted to know how you did it, not the fighting. I mean, how did you take all of it for so long without breaking? How did you stay so controlled?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "My grandfather taught me that true strength comes from understanding yourself, your capabilities, your limitations, your values. When you know who you are, what others think or do to you becomes less important. You endured my restraint as weakness because you've never experienced real strength. The strength to choose mercy when you could choose violence, to choose patience when you could choose revenge. I don't understand that, Blake admitted. If you could have destroyed us at any time, why didn't you? Because destruction is easy, building is hard. If I had fought you on the first day, what would have changed? You might have left me alone, but you would have continued tormenting others. By waiting, by letting you escalate, by forcing you to show your true nature in front of everyone, I didn't just stop you from bullying me. I stopped you from bullying anyone. Blake was quiet for a long moment. My therapist wants me to apologize to everyone I hurt. Says it's part of taking responsibility. That's a good start. Would you? Blake hesitated, then pushed forward. Would you teach me? Not just fighting. The other stuff. The control, the discipline. I don't want to be the person I was. Ethan studied him carefully, looking for deception, for some angle. But all he saw was a 17-year-old who had finally had his worldview shattered and was trying to piece together something better from the fragments. The dojo is open to anyone who comes with genuine intention to learn, Ethan said finally. But understand, the physical techniques are the smallest part of what I teach. The real training is much harder. It requires facing yourself, your weaknesses, your fears. It requires humility, patience, and a willingness to be broken down and rebuilt. I'm already broken, Blake said quietly. Maybe it's time to try the rebuilding part. Ethan extended his hand. Tuesday and Thursday, 4 p.m., don't be late. Blake shook his hand, his grip firm but not challenging. I'll be there. As Blake left, Ethan reflected on the strange turns life could take. His grandfather would appreciate the irony, the bully becoming the student, the tormentor seeking wisdom from his former victim. It was a reminder that even the most unlikely people could change if given the opportunity and the tools. His father returned from overseas 2 weeks later. James Chen was a quiet man, dangerous in the way that true professionals always were, competent, controlled, and absolutely lethal when necessary. He listened to the whole story, watched the videos, and then simply pulled his son into a fierce hug. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You showed restraint when you could have, and strength when you had to. I'm proud of you." "I thought you might be angry that I let it go on so long," Ethan admitted. "Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when not to fight," his father replied. "You waited for the right moment when you could solve the problem completely rather than just postponing it. That's tactical thinking." That evening, the Chen family had dinner with Ethan's grandfather, who had flown in from San Francisco after hearing about the incident. Master Chen Wei watched the videos with the critical eye of someone who had seen real combat, noting technique, critiquing choices, but ultimately nodding with satisfaction. "You remembered your training," he said simply. "Not just the moves, but the philosophy. You protected those who couldn't protect themselves. You used minimum force for maximum effect. You gave your enemies every opportunity to withdraw. And when forced to act, you did so decisively, but without cruelty. This is the way of the warrior." "I'm not a warrior, grandfather," Ethan protested. "No?" The old man's weathered face creased into a knowing smile, the kind that held generations of wisdom passed down through centuries of warriors who understood that the greatest battles were often fought without throwing a single punch. His eyes, still sharp despite his years, studied his grandson with a mixture of pride and understanding. "You stood alone against superior numbers to protect the innocent. You endured months of suffering without complaint, bearing humiliation and pain in silence until action became not just necessary, but unavoidable. You showed mercy to defeated enemies when you had every right to seek vengeance, and displayed wisdom beyond your years in choosing rehabilitation over retribution. If that's not a warrior, grandson, what is?" The rest of the school year passed in a blur of changes that seemed both sudden and inevitable, like a dam breaking after years of pressure. The self-defense club that had started with just 5 nervous students grew to over 50 members, transforming from a small gathering in an unused classroom to requiring the gymnasium twice a week. The membership was diverse: athletes and artists, popular kids and outcasts, all training together with a shared understanding that strength wasn't about domination, but protection. Most surprisingly, the regular attendees included Blake Morrison, who drove 45 minutes from Milton Prep twice a week to attend, his expensive car looking out of place in Riverside's modest parking lot. He was a different person within the dojo walls, quiet where he'd once been loud, respectful where he'd once been dismissive, working harder than anyone else to master not just the physical techniques, but the philosophical principles behind them. He stayed after every session, asking questions about control, about redemption, about how to make amends for damage that couldn't be undone. The changes rippled through Riverside Academy like waves from a stone thrown into still water, each circle wider than the last. A peer mediation program was established, with former bullies and victims working together to resolve conflicts before they escalated. The administration, shocked into action by the cafeteria incident and the public scrutiny that followed, implemented real anti-bullying policies with actual consequences, not just stern warnings and empty threats, but mandatory counseling, community service, and, in severe cases, expulsion. The social dynamics that had governed the school for generations shifted from rigid hierarchies based on athletic prowess or family wealth to something more egalitarian, where kindness and character began to matter more than intimidation and inherited status. Timothy Park, the small freshman who had cowered in corners for months, emboldened by Ethan's example and strengthened by the training from the self-defense club, started standing up for other students when he witnessed unfairness. His voice, once barely a whisper, grew stronger with each intervention. Sarah Williams, who had hidden in the shadows for 3 years, her artistic talents suppressed by fear of standing out, ran for student council on a platform of inclusivity and won by a landslide. David Martinez, who had once eaten lunch in bathroom stalls to avoid the cafeteria's dangers, started a support group for bullying victims that evolved into a peer counseling program, eventually becoming a model replicated by other schools in the district. The videos of the cafeteria fight became something of a phenomenon online, viewed millions of times across various platforms, spawning countless discussions about bullying, self-defense, and the nature of strength in modern society. The footage was analyzed by martial arts experts who praised Ethan's restraint and technique, by psychologists who discussed the trauma responses visible in both attackers and defenders, by educators who used it as a teaching tool about intervention and bystander responsibility. Ethan received offers from martial arts schools wanting him to become their spokesperson, from reality TV shows eager to turn his story into entertainment, from people wanting to transform his experience into something marketable and profitable. He declined them all with polite firmness, preferring his privacy and the quiet satisfaction of seeing real, lasting change in his community. On the last day of school, as students cleaned out their lockers with the chaotic energy of impending summer freedom, saying their goodbyes with promises to stay in touch that some would keep and others would forget, Blake approached Ethan one final time. The transformation was remarkable. He'd been training consistently for 6 months, and the changes weren't just physical, though those were apparent in his improved posture and the way he moved with controlled purpose rather than aggressive swagger. The arrogance that had once radiated from him like heat from a fire was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. The cruel edge that had made him dangerous had softened into something more like determination, focused inward rather than projected outward as a weapon. "I'm transferring back next year," Blake announced, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of nervousness, as if he was still uncertain of his welcome. "My dad fought it hard, said it would look bad on college applications, that Riverside wasn't prestigious enough, but my mom insisted. She says I need to face what I did properly, make amends to the people I hurt, not just run away to another school and pretend it never happened." "That takes courage," Ethan acknowledged, recognizing the difficulty of returning to face one's past mistakes. "More courage than throwing punches ever required." "I wanted to tell you something," Blake continued, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his backpack in a nervous gesture the old Blake would never have displayed. I've been volunteering at the middle school, 3 days a week after school, teaching kids about bullying from the bully's perspective, helping them understand why people do it, the insecurity, the fear, the need for control that comes from feeling powerless in other areas, how to recognize the patterns, how to stop it before it starts, how to reach out for help when they see it happening. It's hard, admitting what I was to these kids, seeing their faces when I describe the things I did. But if it helps even one of them avoid becoming what I was, or helps one victim stand up for themselves, or gives one bystander the courage to intervene, maybe it's worth the discomfort. Ethan smiled, the first genuine, unreserved smile Blake had ever received from him. It transformed his usually serious face, making him look younger, more like the teenager he actually was rather than someone forced to grow up too fast. My grandfather says that the greatest victory is not in defeating an enemy, but in turning an enemy into an ally. Not in destroying your opponent, but in helping them destroy the worst parts of themselves. I think he'd be proud of how far you've come. I'm not an ally yet, Blake said honestly, meeting Ethan's eyes directly, no longer flinching from the contact. I still have work to do, amends to make, trust to earn, but maybe someday. If I keep working at it, if I don't give up when it gets hard, if I remember that change is a process, not a destination. As Blake walked away, his shoulders straighter than they'd been in months, Ethan thought about the strange, painful, ultimately transformative journey of the past year. He'd started as the quiet new kid, hoping to blend into the background and finish high school without incident. He'd become a victim, targeted for his quietness, his difference, his refusal to engage with the social hierarchies that governed teenage life. He'd evolved into a defender, not just of himself, but of others who couldn't defend themselves. And somehow, through circumstances he could never have predicted, he'd ended up as a teacher and catalyst for change that extended far beyond the walls of Riverside Academy. The bullies who had tried to strangle him in front of everyone that day, thinking they were making an example of him, had indeed made a big mistake, but not in the way they'd expected. Their mistake wasn't simply in targeting someone who could fight back, though that had been a serious miscalculation. It was in failing to understand that true strength wasn't about dominance or fear, wasn't about making others feel small so you could feel big. Their fundamental error was in believing that power came from the ability to hurt rather than the ability to help, from breaking others down rather than building them up. True strength was what Ethan had shown that day in the cafeteria, the ability to stand up not just for yourself, but for others who couldn't stand for themselves, to show mercy even in victory when every instinct screamed for revenge, to transform conflict into growth rather than perpetuating cycles of violence. The revenge he'd taken wasn't violent or cruel, though he'd had every opportunity and justification for both. It was something far more powerful and lasting. He'd forced them to see themselves clearly, without the comfortable lies and justifications they'd used to excuse their behavior. He'd confronted them with their own weakness masquerading as strength, and in doing so, had given them the unexpected gift of an opportunity to become better. The tiger had indeed shown his claws when the monkey went too far, just as his grandfather's old proverb had warned. But instead of destroying the monkey with those claws, leaving it broken and bitter, he'd taught it to be something more than it was. He'd shown it that there were different ways to be strong, that power didn't have to be cruel, that respect earned through fear wasn't respect at all, but merely compliance waiting for an opportunity to rebel. Years later, when Ethan had graduated with honors and moved on to college, when the students of that time had scattered to their various futures like seeds on the wind, the legend of the cafeteria fight lived on at Riverside Academy. But it had evolved from a simple story of violence and retribution into something more complex and meaningful. A reminder that one person standing up at the right moment with the right principles could change everything, that strength came in many forms beyond the physical, and that even the worst bullies could be redeemed if given the chance and the tools to change. It became a touchstone story, told to incoming freshmen during orientation, referenced when conflicts arose, used as an example of how things could be different. Blake Morrison went on to become a counselor specializing in youth violence prevention, his office walls decorated with certificates and degrees. But the most prominent decoration was a simple framed quote: "The greatest victory is turning an enemy into an ally." He used his own story as both cautionary tale and inspiration, never shying away from the ugly truth of who he'd been, but also demonstrating who someone could become with effort and genuine desire to change. He spoke at schools across the country, his presentations starting with the video of the cafeteria fight, using his own humiliation as a teaching tool. Mason, whose size had once been used as a weapon of intimidation, became a pediatric physical therapist, helping children recover from injuries with a gentleness that would have shocked his teenage self. He specialized in working with victims of violence, understanding their fear in a way that came from having once been the source of such fear. Kyle founded an anti-bullying nonprofit that grew from a local initiative to a national organization, developing programs that were implemented in hundreds of schools. Ryan became a middle school teacher, determined to be the adult who noticed and acted when students were suffering, the adult he'd wished had existed during his own years as a bully and the years before when he'd been bullied himself. And Ethan? He studied psychology and martial arts in college, eventually earning advanced degrees in both, understanding that the mind and body were not separate entities but parts of an integrated whole. He opened his own dojo that focused as much on mental and emotional development as physical training, where meditation was as important as sparring, where students learned to master themselves before attempting to master others. Above the entrance, he hung a hand-carved plaque with his grandfather's favorite saying in both English and Chinese: "The warrior who wins without fighting achieves the greatest victory." Every student who entered his dojo understood from their first day that they weren't just learning to defend themselves physically. They were learning to be defenders, protectors, people who stood up for what was right even when it was dangerous or difficult or when everyone else remained silent. They were learning that true strength wasn't about being able to hurt others, but about having the power to help them, even when those others had tried to hurt you. They learned that mercy wasn't weakness, but the ultimate expression of strength, that forgiveness wasn't forgetting, but choosing to transform pain into purpose. The confrontation in the cafeteria had begun with Blake's hand around Ethan's throat, a moment of violence that could have ended tragically, with serious injury, with death, with lives destroyed by a moment of teenage cruelty taken too far. But it had transformed into something none of them could have predicted, a catalyst for growth that spread like ripples across a pond. Change that affected not just the immediate participants, but entire communities, and ultimately, redemption for those who seemed beyond redemption. The bullies had indeed picked the wrong target, but in doing so, they'd inadvertently picked exactly the right person to show them a better way. Someone who had the skills to defend himself, but more importantly, the wisdom to know that true victory lay not in destruction, but in transformation. The story spread beyond Riverside Academy, shared in forums and academic discussions about bullying, self-defense, and conflict resolution. Experts analyzed the videos frame by frame, noting Ethan's restraint even in the heat of combat, his tactical decision-making that minimized harm while maximizing effectiveness, his precise application of force that neutralized threats without causing permanent damage. But what most impressed them, what became the subject of papers and presentations, was what happened after, the transformation of a culture of fear and violence into one of mutual respect and protection, the redemption of bullies who by all rights should have been written off, the empowerment of victims who found their voices and their strength. Some called it justice, a satisfying moment of karmic retribution, where bullies got what they deserved. Others called it karma, the universe balancing its scales in a moment of perfect symmetry. But Ethan knew what it really was, the natural consequence of his grandfather's teaching playing out in real life, principles that had been developed over centuries, proving their relevance in a modern American high school. Violence was sometimes necessary, a last resort when all other options were exhausted, but it was never the goal. The goal was peace, growth, and the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves, and sometimes Achieving that goal meant showing people that their perceived strength was actually weakness, that their power was an illusion built on the suffering of others, and that real strength came from discipline, training, and above all, the choice to be better than your circumstances demanded. The bullies had tried to strangle him in front of everyone, thinking they were demonstrating their power, cementing their position at the top of the social hierarchy through a display of dominance. Instead, they demonstrated their weakness, their fear of anything different, their fundamental misunderstanding of what strength really meant. And in their defeat, they'd found something they never expected, not just humiliation or punishment, but a path to becoming better people, stronger in ways they'd never imagined possible, and ultimately, grateful for the lesson learned that day in the cafeteria when they picked the wrong target and discovered that sometimes losing a fight is the first step to winning at life. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. There were setbacks, moments of regression, times when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, but the seed had been planted, and with careful tending, through the self-defense club, through counseling, through the constant example of a different way to be strong, it grew into something beautiful and lasting. The culture of Riverside Academy changed not through administrative decree or zero-tolerance policies, but through the understanding that spread student by student, that everyone had the potential for both cruelty and kindness, that strength could protect rather than harm, and that the choice of which path to take was always available, no matter how far down the wrong path someone had already traveled. The story became legend, but more importantly, it became a living example that change was possible, that cycles could be broken, that even the worst moments could become catalysts for transformation if met with wisdom rather than vengeance. And at the center of it all was a quiet young man who had learned from his grandfather that the way of the warrior was not the way of violence, but the way of protection, not the path of dominance, but the path of service, not the pursuit of victory over others, but the pursuit of victory over one's own weaknesses and fears. The bullies had made a mistake that day, but it was the kind of mistake that, paradoxically, turned out to be exactly what everyone needed. A moment of crisis that became a moment of transformation, a confrontation that became a catalyst, a fight that ended not just violence, but the culture that had created it. They had indeed picked the wrong target, but in doing so, they had picked the right teacher, the right moment, and ultimately, the right path to redemption.